On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the cycle of change, an incredibly useful tool for helping us to better understand where people are within the process of changing a behavior or a habit. Understanding this tool can significantly improve our ability to be able to understand, but also strategize how we can help a person, guide them through improving habits and making changes. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Able to Care podcast. I'm your host, Andy Baker. And on today's episode, we're going to be looking at the cycle of change. So I came across the cycle of change a number of years ago, and I'll make sure I get the names of the people who developed it right. So the example of the one I'm kind of looking at to remind me of this process is Prochaska and DeClement. Okay, so the cycle of change is something I use in a number of different environments, and I've taught it in a number of different courses. And I find it really useful to help people to better understand why people do what they do or how we should approach kind of changes. Now, a bit of a proviso here as far as when we're looking to promote change, we should never necessarily be dictating what somebody should or should not be doing. However, for many individuals, sometimes their behavior can be maladaptive. It can be negative for their well-being. It could be detrimental for themselves or others. And whether that's been decided as far as a best interest assessment due to the person lacking the capacity to make that decision for themselves, or whether it be something we're working with the person to try and help them to improve their quality of life, and we are getting that consent to some degree. But knowing where a person is on the cycle of change can be really useful to know how we should approaching. But I also found it useful for me to better cope and get less frustrated with the person if I thought they were doing something that I felt was maladaptive or not in their best interests. I tend to use when I'm teaching this as a bit of an example, whether it be going on a diet or whether it be quitting smoking. And I might flip between the two. If anybody is listening or watching that does smoke or has certain relationship with food, please, I do not judge. Everybody is entitled to live their life. However, there are two examples that most people can relate to, because most people, even most smokers, have probably tried to quit smoking at some point or another. Some haven't, but some have, okay? So they're quite good examples that we can refer to. But I use this course in subjects like self-harm, for instance. It's quite good to understand why people are still engaging in self-harming behavior and where they are in the cycle of change. But we can also use it for most changes in behavior to some degree or another. Okay. So starting off, the top of the cycle is what we call the pre-contemplation stage. The pre-contemplation stage is basically the individual has no intent on changing a behavior. So this is where, I try and get over to people with this. Nobody goes on a diet if they don't see a problem with their weight. Okay. Nobody quits smoking if they don't want to or don't see a problem with smoking. So if a person is in the pre-contemplation stage, they have no intent on changing behavior. They probably see nothing wrong with their behavior, or they don't see it as detrimental. Or it's definitely, we're looking at the kind of the cost benefit analysis. They perceive the benefits of the behavior they're engaging in as far more beneficial than the costs of changing that behavior. Okay. And we have to understand any behavior we come across, any behavior a person displays that we find detrimental or negative or anything, it must have a benefit to it. Whether it be to help them to cope with the stress, to feel safer, or to meet a need, or whether to gain or avoid something, there must be a benefit. Okay, so in the pre-contemplation stage, they cannot see the cost of changing as being a benefit to outweigh the benefit of maintaining. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to do. So if we're looking to kind of initiate change, we're not going to do it by going, you should quit smoking, you should go on a diet. In fact, quite often has the adverse effect that many smokers, when told they should quit smoking, go and have two as a result. So the pre-contemplation stage, we want to try and help them or expose them to information about the risks of maintaining the behavior they currently are and potentially the benefits of an alternative behavior that they may not be adopting. So this is kind of what the government did in some ways, and it kind of worked and kind of didn't. Why they put the pictures on the packets of cigarettes to show you how bad smoking is for you. So by kind of promoting how bad it is for you, they're trying to cause a pain to the behavior that outweighs the benefit people get from the behavior. The other way of doing that would be promoting the benefits of an alternative behavior. So if they could kind of help people to realize how much money they would save by not smoking, for instance, rather than just doing it as punitive by going, hey, look at the money you've saved by not smoking that one cigarette yesterday, then that would be an alternative, as an example, okay? So the next stage of the cycle of change is what we call contemplation. And contemplation is they're aware of the problem, they're aware that their behavior is maybe maladaptive, that isn't the best thing for them, but they're not committed to any action to change it. They are still in that kind of the cost and benefits now have shifted slightly. They're starting to see the cost. They're more aware of them, but the benefit still currently outweighs, or the pain of quitting or changing outweighs the benefit of whatever thing they could get. Okay. So let's say, as far as smoking is concerned, I know if I quit smoking, I could have extra money to go on holiday, but that's not enough of an incentive to make me quit yet. But I'm a former smoker, and I remember going through a period where it was a case of, I don't really want to smoke. I wish I'd never started, but I don't want to quit. That's kind of what I used to say to myself. And sometimes when we're looking at the contemplation kind, is it skill or is it desire? Because sometimes people have a higher level of desire. I want to quit, I just don't think I can. And that's a little bit different from being, I can quit anytime I want, I just don't want to. And that's where we're kind of moving through the pre-contemplation to contemplation. Sometimes it's about a skill. So now they don't know necessarily how to go about doing it, but they're still also weighing up the pros and cons. So again, continued exposure to the costs and the benefit of the change, but also maybe now's the time of we're exposing, again, the kind of government did this as far as, showing the other things they could do as far as patches and the gum, and they create packs where people can get more information about the alternatives they could use instead of cigarettes to meet those needs or to get that kind of need fulfilled, whatever people use the cigarettes for. The next level then is the preparation. So at preparation, this is where a person has actually gone, do you know what? I want to do this. I want to make a change. So they're intent on taking some action to address the problem. They're now starting to goal set. They're starting to plan it. They're starting to think, well, how am I going to go about doing this? And it could be a case of, well, here are the replacements that I'm going to use to swap that behavior. So if I use this particular behavior to meet this particular need, maybe I can meet that need in a similar way. So I'll use for myself. I'm hoping you don't mind the fact that I'm sharing. So when I first quit smoking, I quit smoking for the age of 16 to 24. I quit smoking and I use acupuncture. Now, I don't know how much the acupuncture worked, but I spent like 100 or something quid, which was quite a lot of money for me back then. So therefore I thought, I worked it out that I had to quit smoking for a month because that's how much it would have cost me in cigarettes, the same amount in cigarettes. So I thought, I've got to quit for the month because otherwise I'm just wasting my money twice. But what was most beneficial for me is they gave me as well as the acupuncture, they gave me a little thing of like Albis oil. It's kind of like Albis oil, but kind of strong smelling, menthol-y kind of medication that we just inhaled it. But actually, the action of me unscrewing the lid, taking this menthol kind of sniff, and there was no pharmaceuticals in there. It was much more a menthol, like a bit chewing gummy. By doing that for the 3 seconds, the craving then had gone by the time I'd done that. And I found that a really useful replacement. When I felt like one, I replaced it with a different behavior that involved my hands, involved my kind of breathing, very similar to what smoking would do. Some people prefer chewing gum, some people prefer patches. There's lots of alternatives out there. Some people obviously go over to vapes, but then they create a new challenging habit. Okay? But the preparation is, how am I going to go about doing this? And then the next stage is action. Is actually initiating this. Now, one thing you'll find with action when people are taking or looking at changes, how many is it going to, I'm going to go on a diet tomorrow. I'm going to go on a diet. I'm going to start my diet on Monday. I'm going to pig out as much as I can this weekend, and then I'll start on Monday, whatever. And I think that for me is still, they're semi in the contemplation stage. They're still creating that situation where they can back out. Sometimes I have genuinely made a choice. But I think if you're going to do something, for me, there's an element, well, I might as well start it straight away. I might as well do it now. If I'm going, well, I'll just finish this pack of cigarettes, then your mentality's still wrong. Why wouldn't you be willing to just throw those cigarettes in the bin and go, I'm starting now? Because that's a waste of money, whether I smoke them or not. And therefore, I might as well just make that choice, make that decision, and they're gone forever. But that's when I make a decision, I'm quite on it. And I've tried to forcibly do it where I don't wait and kind of make excuses of why I need to keep doing things. Because we're all guilty of that. And sometimes tomorrow never comes. And I've definitely fallen foul of that in my past. The action is actually then I'm activating this, I'm changing it, I'm doing it, I'm initiating this new routine and habit. Now, I could probably do another podcast, and I'm sure we will. And there's actually a lady I'd really like to get on the podcast to talk about habit changing, because changing habits is so important and so beneficial for us, but it isn't always the easiest thing to do. And having some strategies to change habits. And I think some of us kind of try to change things all in one go. And I found that easier when I quit smoking. I also quit drinking for a few months. I kind of quit eating poor diet. I kind of changed my lifestyle completely because I found that's massive change, changed all my routines. And therefore my routines were so changed, I didn't get the same triggers to then want to have a cigarette as well. That's kind of another thing I did by not having that beer, wanting the cigarette with the beer straight away. That kind of helped me to then reduce the triggers between. So that was one way I did it. But other people find it easier to set up habits. And there's a wonderful book called Atomic Habits, which I'd recommend anybody to read, which looks at just small changes over a period of time can make big differences. So the actions where we actually start it. Next stage then is maintenance, which is sustaining that change, keeping going with it. Now, it's getting that habit ingrained. And there is statistics, I can never remember how many times we have to do something to actually, for a habit to become ingrained. And it isn't, I think it's in the hundreds of times for it to become automated. We can learn something in 60 times or something like that, but then to make it automatic, to make it do it without thinking, it requires significantly more. Now, the one really important part, or there's all important parts of the cycle of change, but there's one bit that I think is really worth being aware of and addressing is what we call relapse. Now, relapse is a huge and normal part of the cycle of change. There's a famous quote from Mark Twain that says, "Quitting smoking's easy. I've done it hundreds of times." And that is the relapse stage of any change. There will be times when we relapse into old habits. I use an analogy quite often that all our habits are like pathways through the forest, as far as they're a neuron connection through the forest that is our brain. And the pathways we walk often become very ingrained and become kind of uncomfortable, and we walk them regularly and they just stay there forever. So unfortunately, when we create a habit, like when I'm stressed, I use a cigarette to cope. And that's a kind of a pathway through the forest of, if X happens, then I do Y, and that makes me feel Z, and that kind of then works. When then I feel lost, when I feel a bit uncertain, when I'm feeling a state of stress that feels difficult again, and I don't have good strategies to maybe deal with it, I'm probably going to go over to an old pathway. So I'll use, and I'm happy to kind of share it, in that I quit smoking for nearly 12 years and I went for a major relationship breakdown and I started smoking again because I felt lost. So I went back to an old habit. Okay. And that's really easy to do. The thing is, there's a difference between like lapse and then relapse. So kind of lapse is kind of just, I've had one. Now we've all done it though. And this is the important thing to recognize. This is a normal part of the cycle of change where I'm on a diet and have one chocolate bar. And then it's a case of, oh, what's the point of diet? I've messed it up. So, well, actually, no, you just had a chocolate bar. You can restart your action and your maintenance tomorrow. You've not lost anything. Just one event doesn't. And that's trying to help people to prevent them from catastrophizing or maximizing the problems and things like that. Some of the automatic negative thoughts that kick into people's heads when it comes to what they perceive as a failure. And failure only occurs when we give up, when we quit. One thing to kind of recognize from the relapse is that every time that I go through this cycle, every time I go through contemplation, preparation, action and maintenance, and then relapse, every time I go through that, my confidence to be able to make changes actually improves. It goes up. So even though I keep going around in a cycle and this keep going around to going back to pre-contemplation, it becomes easier every time I choose to quit because I've done it once. I know I could do it again. So it still is an improvement. Every time round it, we learn from each relapse. Maybe we learn where we went wrong. We learn what triggered us. We learn maybe what we didn't have in place to replace that habit, that behavior that maybe we need to look at in the future. So hopefully you found those different stages of the cycle of change useful. I think it's really important to understand where a person is on that journey, because if I'm trying to goal set about how we're going to change a behavior when a person's still in a pre-contemplation, they're not going to engage in those goals. They're not going to make those changes. So we need to help them to realize the benefit of changing that behavior versus the cost of maintaining it for them, and always looking at their best interest and the best outcome for them. And that's where we have to be very mindful of our own values, beliefs, and attitudes. I have, as I mentioned, used this cycle of change in a number of different environments and different occasions. Self-harm is one I always think's quite useful to kind of put it against. But again, still in that pre-contemplation, this is where in the early stages of building a relationship, building rapport, or stabilization of something like the trauma recovery model, it needs to be focused on connecting with the person rather than trying to change the person, valuing them, accepting them for who they are, rather than thinking immediately they should be different. However, it's helping them to recognize that they want to make that change for themselves. And to do that, I'm going to need some acceptance. I'm going to need some support. I'm going to need to know that I can do this through building my self-esteem rather than knocking me down in the fact that I always mess up and I always fail. Some people will react to that kind of like, hey, you tell me I can't and I'm going to do it. But some people react, you tell me you can't often enough, I give up even trying, and we generate that learned helplessness. I highly recommend looking into more about the cycle of change, having a better understanding of what it is and how to help a person through those different stages. But also deciding and always evaluating, am I doing this for them or am I doing it for me because I think it's right? And always making sure it is person-centered. But there's loads of different examples that we could utilize this. And maybe in the comments, you could kind of, give an example of maybe a situation or a time where you've changed a habit, you've changed a behavior, and you could be aware in hindsight of where you are on that cycle of change and what you did at the different elements of that cycle of change. But otherwise, thank you very much.